I'm so glad you can come back to the Mindful Mama podcast. It's great to talk to you. And yeah, we were just saying, you came on in 2021. I can't believe it. Episode 277 for people. You were talking about toddlers then, and now you have a 3-year-old. Before we talk about toddlers in general, 3, what's your assessment of the age of 3 versus 2? Because this is like a big debate in the toddler world. It's like it's always framed as like what's worse, but what do you think?
Yeah, well, I can say that about 2.5 weeks after my son turned 3, I saw a massive shift in his behavior where like he was never interested in like pulling things off counters. Now all of a sudden he's doing that. He like just being a little more like kind of like ornery and more independent, wanting to do things by himself, but then also just taking it upon himself to go do some things without telling us. And I was like, oh yeah, we definitely just entered a whole new stage of independence here.
Yeah, all that autonomy stuff. It's so funny. Maybe this is when my family, we talk about that we try to joke that we all are like 3% evil. You know, like everybody's like at least 3% evil. And like we'll joke like that's where is 3% evil coming out. But maybe this is like 3 is when you develop your 3% evil.
Yeah, it's so funny because there was definitely just like a really, really clear shift in behavior. I'm like, oh, we're not in 2s anymore.
Yeah, it can be really, really different. Okay, so we are going to talk about 2s. We're going to talk about those little ones again because people hear about the 2s. They hear about the terrible 2s. They brace themselves. And I wanted to know, what is the biggest misconception about toddlerhood that you want to change with your new book that is out today? Yay!
Well, gosh, it's so hard to just choose one thing, but I think like overarchingly, what I want parents to understand is even though toddlers have a bad reputation and society has coined all these terms like terrible 2s, 3-nager, all the things, really, in fact, toddlerhood is a critical developmental period. Yes, it's absolutely challenging and there are many, many ups and downs, but it's also a critical developmental period that really sets the foundation for brain development and resilience for the rest of your child's life. So it is also a really great opportunity. So if we enter toddlerhood just bracing ourselves, kind of like white knuckling it, ready for all the bad things that, society is like telling us about, then we start to miss these beautiful moments where your child is having so many firsts. They're learning to walk, they're learning to talk, they're starting to ride a bike. They are learning so many new things. You get to discover their personality and they have so little life experience and their brains are still maturing. They really are here to learn and grow, and we can have such a massive impact during this time period that we don't want to just white knuckle it and wish it away.
Okay, you said words like massive impact and critical for development. For like me, when my kids were 2, like those kind of words scared the bejesus out of me because I was like, I'm making mistakes left and right. I'm really scared that I'm messing my kid up, and then it's so important the first 3 years I'm messing them up for life. Can you tell us what exactly do you mean when you mean critical for development? And like when I was, losing it at my kid, was I messing them up for life because it's so critical for development?
Yeah, I love this question, right? Because it can be really hard to hear these things because we're exhausted, both physically, mentally, emotionally, and the toddler years can sometimes just feel downright grueling. And so we have these moments where we lose our temper, we lose our patience, where we just don't show up as our best selves. And that is part of being human. So while I will say this is a critical developmental period, that the amount of neural pathways and connections being made during these years is just skyrocketing. And what we know about brain science is that, the neural pathways that are being used, they get stronger. The ones that aren't being used, get pruned away. That being said, the brain, I'm sure you talk about this a lot, has neuroplasticity. So the brain can always change. But what is so important to know is that Your child does not need a perfect parent. And I talk about this so much in my book because all the messy moments, our child's messy moments, they are all opportunities for growth and for learning. And if you're willing to be a human parent, to be vulnerable and to learn alongside your child, then you and your child will come out of this on the other side and everything will be okay, because it's truly not about being a perfect parent. It's about being a learning and growing parent.
Okay, so I'm not necessarily messing up my kids as
No.
long as there's some repair and things like that. I mean, you talk about this on the toddler side. You talk about how, these things that we call bad behavior are actually very developmentally appropriate. And I was wondering if you could share an example where a parent's perspective shift transformed the dynamic of the situation.
Yeah,
Shift towards seeing it that way.
Yes. I would even love to just share my own story where, for years I was a nanny for high profile families all over the world. And I even myself, there was so much pressure right out in public to have the child behave, do this, do that, all the things that I was really wrapped up in this idea that if the child was having good behavior, I was doing a good job. I was successful. If they're having bad behavior, kicking, screaming, crying, hitting, biting, anything like this, then I must be doing a bad job. Child is bad. I'm bad. Everyone's messing up. It's a big problem. But once I started to understand that toddlers communicate with their behavior, that all behavior is communication. So we want to shift from this idea that my child is bad, rude, mean, manipulative, to my child's having a hard time, or my child's trying to tell me something, and we start getting curious about what's happening beneath the surface of the behavior. Are they communicating feelings, emotions, needs, desires? What's happening there? We start to understand, oh my gosh, they're not doing this to me. They are not bad. I am not failing. This is developmentally normal, typical behavior, and it's my job as the adult here to get curious about what's happening beneath the behavior, address those feelings, emotions, and needs, and that's where the true transformation comes in how we respond, because when we stop viewing the behavior as bad, we're more likely to respond in a more connected, compassionate way. And then we are going to get further with our child when they feel seen, heard, and understood.
Okay, so do you have an example of something like that when you were able to shift that perspective from that?
10,000%. So I just remember this one beautiful day of, it was just from when you wake up in the morning, right? I'm sure people listening have had these days, and you probably have too, where you wake up and it's just crying first thing in the morning. Nothing is pleasing them. Nothing is right? The toast is cut wrong. The cup is the wrong color, all the things. And I remember this little kiddo, he hit me. I put him in timeout. And he was so upset and crying so hard. And I was so upset and on the verge of tears. And that's when I just realized, I was like, oh my gosh, we are just two human beings having a hard time right now. He is not trying to hurt me or be bad. He is struggling right now. And I am struggling too, to stay calm about it. And once I just realized that we're all human, I was like, oh my gosh. And I gave him a big hug. I was like, we can figure this out together. What's going on here? And that was really a turning point in the relationship, and where connection started to take, more real estate. It was really a priority, and things just started to shift. It's amazing what an underrated tool connection is, that it's really the balm that soothes all the emotions and all of the challenges.
I think probably a lot of times it can feel scary to, I imagine kind of subconsciously it can feel scary to connect, right? If you're feeling if you're feeling undersupported, right? Because parents just have so little support in general, as far as the structures of the world and the way things are. If you're feeling undersupported, maybe you're feeling emotional, you're feeling overwhelmed by this kid who's also woke up and is having a bad day and is feeling overwhelmed. And I can imagine that it's, to connect means to connect also with yourself, right? To connect with what's happening with you in that moment, and to connect with feelings that are uncomfortable maybe, or scarier, that you don't want to look at. Like, I'm maybe unhappy in this moment. I'm maybe struggling as a parent. Maybe I don't like being a parent right now. And it's maybe frightening to look at those things. So in some ways, the idea of like outwardly controlling the behavior, or just having some technique to make your child do this thing feels safer in some way than like actually kind of getting present with whatever's happening with us in that moment. Even though we may read your books, they may read my book, right? May read all these books and say like, oh, it's connection, yes. And in our good moments, we're there, we're with it, we resonate with that truth. And then in those hard moments, it's just hard to it can be hard to connect with that vulnerable part of ourselves.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, this is also what comes back to this idea of, society having the labels of like terrible to three-nager, right? Because for the most part, we're just taught to not accept the full spectrum of emotions, right? Like, we're conditioned to that from a pretty young age, that we want to try to like hold close the quote unquote like good emotions and shove away or get rid of the bad emotions. And so this plays out in parenting in so many different ways, not only with how we view our child's behavior, but how we view ourselves as parents and caregivers, and even how willing we are to even be present with our own feelings, emotions, and needs. And it can feel scary to be really vulnerable in that way. Absolutely.
That's interesting. It's food for thought for kind of thinking about like that. Is that, for the listener, like, is that connection to my kid? Is that, do I have a hesitancy about connection with myself? That's an interesting something to gnaw on. But I also want to get us into some things that are more along the lines of a little bit into tips and tricks for those tough moments, right? Like, sometimes when we're in those tough moments, a lot of times parents want to set limits, and you're like, oh, and I'm out of ideas. And so it's you're into bribes, threats, or yelling. So what's one go-to script from your book that parents can start using today to give them a little shortcut?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think one thing that I talk about a lot in my book is your role versus your child's role in setting limits. And I always say that we have 3 jobs and the child has 3 jobs. It's our job to set the limit, and it's their job to test it, because toddlers are going to test limits because they're developmentally wired to exert their will and become their own person. And it's our job to follow through on the limits that we set. And then it's their job to have a reaction to it when they realize that their sense of control is being challenged, because toddlers don't have a lot of control over their lives, but because they're trying to become their own individual, they crave a sense of control. And then it's our job to really support their big feelings and emotions, and it's their job to accept the limit. And so just knowing everyone's role is really important in success in setting limits. And then when we take that out into, the real world and we're parenting our kids, one interesting thing that I see around setting limits is that posing limits as a question, and I've done this many times, and it backfires most of the time, where we say something like, do you want to take a bath? And instead of saying, do you want to take a bath? Because we're posing this as like a yes or no question, even though what we mean to say is it's bath time, right? So what we want to say instead is a statement, something like it's bath time. And then perhaps we want to give them a choice. Like, do you want to have bubbles or do you want to have a color bath? Or do you want a piggyback ride or do you want to race me or something like this? And so we can give them a sense of control within our boundaries in other ways. But when we set a limit or we try to give a directive to our child and we pose it as a question, then oftentimes we're going to get an answer that we don't like, especially because toddlers are developmentally wired to say no right now as they're trying to become their own person.
Oh, okay. All right. So don't ask the question. Do you want to go to the park? Do you want a snack? Do you want, yeah.
Unless you're okay with no.
Yeah,
if you're okay with the answer being no, then great. But if no wasn't an option, don't make it be an option.
I mean, that's smart. I mean, and that's good communication for anyone in your life. Like if you were talking to a friend, and sometimes I encourage people to kind of put some of your language through a friend filter. Like, would you ask them if they want to do something when it, that's not how you would talk to a friend. If there wasn't a choice, we'd say, oh, okay, we got to go, rather than do you want to do this, right? That would be a legit question if you're asking a question. That's kind of like a permissive style, isn't it? Maybe if we were asking a lot of questions of your toddler, you might be sliding into some more permissiveness.
Yeah, it's challenging because you want to give your child a sense of control, because when we're meeting that developmental need to have a sense of control, things are going to go more smoothly. But at the same time, we have to make sure that it's within our boundaries. So if we find that a child has too much power, and then that's when we're really sliding into this permissive place of permissiveness, because the child actually has too much power and then they don't know what to do with it, and then their behavior is going to snowball, because actually setting limits helps young children feel safe and have a sense of security, even though they're going to push back on them. But at the same time, it's really supportive for them to have that sense of security and to know where the limit is. And that's one reason why they're always testing them.
Yeah, I like the way you break that down into 3 parts. Like, our job is to set the limit and follow through. This is let's underline and highlight that, and follow through, and then support their feelings when they have a reaction to it. I think that makes so much sense. It's not just you set the limit and then your job is done. That's kind of like when it starts.
Exactly. Yes, that's the very beginning of it. I think that's like one of the biggest mistakes we might make with setting limits is that, when we set a limit and just expect a child to follow through just because we set a limit, just isn't really taking their development into account and their capabilities. And so it's important that, and that goes into, a whole nother conversation of having developmentally realistic expectations for your child. But it's just super important to know that, yes, the first step, just the beginning, is setting the limit.
Yeah. When we think about setting a limit, probably the inevitable reaction, the classic, the feared, the dun dun dun, here it comes reaction is the tantrum, the toddler tantrum, right? So in your experience, what's the most common mistake parents make during a tantrum, and what should they do instead?
Yeah, I post this on Instagram often, this idea that, tantrums are not the time to use logic and explanations, expect your child to answer questions, try to negotiate with them, to shame or punish them to make it stop, or to just ignore your child. And so these are like the common mistakes that parents make, and we know why they do. I mean, we've all been there in these moments, because it's really hard to be faced with your kid's big emotions. It's hard to see your child upset. It's hard to be bombarded with the screaming and crying when you might not be at your best in that moment. And so I think the biggest thing that I want parents to know around tantrums is that you are not a bad parent and your child is not a bad child for having a tantrum, and tantrums are just a release. My good friend Patty Whipler, she always calls them an emotional poop. It's just releasing what's no longer needed. There's nothing bad or wrong or anything that needs fixed around a tantrum. And I think that that is the most important thing to know and embrace. And once you start kind of bringing some humor into it, right, and say, oh, this is just an emotional poop, we can just feel a little bit lighter about it. And then just realize that as long as our child's physically safe, like they're not going to fall off the couch, they're not going to hit their head on, like a tile floor, something like this. So as long as they're safe, we just need to focus on grounding ourselves. Yeah. So our child can then move through those feelings and emotions and then come back to their emotional equilibrium. I feel like in tantrums, oftentimes less is really more in those moments.
Yeah. That's exactly what I say is like, you there's not much to do. You can't, it's happening, right? It's the poop is the emotional poop is happening. Great metaphor. She's got to hook up with Chris Willard when the feelings are like farts.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. That would be so great. And I guess the one thing that I do like tell parents that they can do is this idea of try not to get stuck, like just waiting forever for your child to maybe move on from the tantrum. That sometimes if we move forward, kids are going to be more likely to move forward. And what I mean by that is like this example, my son really loves mango bars and he wanted a mango bar. And I'm like, okay, we already had one. We're not having another. And he was really upset. He didn't want to go eat his food. He wanted another mango bar. So he was standing at the pantry crying and I was standing there with him, upholding the limit, holding space for his feelings. And then I realized that, gosh, this kid still has some type of hope that I'm just going to cave in and give him this mango bar. So I just walked across the room, turned on some music, pulled out his train set and set his plate on the floor beside me. And then after like a minute and a half, which felt like 10 minutes, but it was only probably, a little over a minute, he came over, sat down, wiped his eyes and started eating his food. And we built a train track. And so, it's just it's so important to just understand that sometimes when we can be the leader, kids will follow our lead.
Yeah, there's what you're describing in some ways is like there's a space in some ways for validation, right? But it may not be in that moment, right? Like what you're saying is less and more is more. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the difference between validation of feelings and then also when validation might be kind of egging kids on and things like that. How can parents kind of tell this difference in those situations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's getting to know your child, knowing where you're at in your parenting journey. If there's like an area where like maybe you've started, like you weren't setting a limit in one place and now you've started to set a limit there, there's a good chance your child's going to have some type of hope that this limit's going to change and go back to how it was before. Or even in moments where your child is just, super, super upset and they can't really hear you in those moments, when they're looking for like this idea of, okay, can I make a difference here? Because this is the thing. Some people will say, toddlers are manipulative. But what I like to say is toddlers are strategic because toddlers rely on us to get their needs met. And so a lot of their behavior is really just trying to get their needs met. So they're going to be strategic and be like, okay, this worked one time. Will it work again? This worked with grandma. Will it work with mom? Looking at these things. And so it's really important to get to know your unique child and kind of take the temperature of the situation to understand, yes, I can hold space for my child's emotions, but I also don't want to get stuck on their emotional roller coaster and not have a path to move forward.
Yeah. I think in general, when we're in full-on meltdown, it's like there's no, like you said, less is more. There's nothing to validate there. Like saying your kid you're really upset is kind of it's a moot point and it's not going to help that situation. I like that idea of like, there may be space to move on and shift the tone a little bit more, but there also in that moment can happen for parents, like a lot can come up for us, right? Like you said, to go ground yourself, which I absolutely agree with. I help, we talk about like imagining you're sitting like a mountain, right? Like you're a solid mountain. But you may be in this situation when you're, at least for me, when my kid was having these big upset feelings and these tantrums, for me, it brought up a lot of stuff. Like it brought up this feeling of like this is unacceptable, this behavior, because for me, when I was little and I had tantrums, I was yelled at or spanked and stuff like that. So it brought up a lot of wounds and conditioning from my past. So how can parents recognize when they're reacting from their past rather than responding to what's actually happening in that moment?
Yeah. I always say toddlers are like mirrors, and they're, reflect back to us the areas where we have all these unresolved hurts, where we're still working through things, where we're still healing. And that is probably the hardest part about parenting a toddler, because you go from having an infant where you're just really caregiving, mostly, and they kind of go with the flow for the most part, where then you have a toddler with their own agenda, and it just all of a sudden makes us face so many different things. And I have a chapter in the book really looking at triggers and how to transform them. And I think like the first thing to notice is, what type of labels are you placing on your child's behavior? Are you labeling it as mean, bad, making it mean something about who your child is, because this is going to fuel our upset. And when noticing when you're triggered, this idea of, is your reaction either internally or externally outsized for the event that's happening right now? Because oftentimes, when we're triggered, our reaction actually is much larger than what would be warranted in that situation. Or if you start to notice that you're yelling often, or that you're responding in a way that's really different from your personal values or how you envision yourself as a parent, these are all signs that we're stuck in this cycle, in this stress response, and where we're triggered. And I think what's so beautiful about this, I always say that the first step is awareness. And awareness can do so much, because until we start noticing our patterns, noticing which moments we start to feel this way, where we're getting triggered, it's really challenging to shift it. And so that awareness piece, it seems so basic, but it's actually so important, because it's the whole beginning of really choosing another path.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when you can become aware and not be harsh on yourself, and not blame yourself, and not shame yourself into feeling like a miserable puddle on the floor, yeah, then that's actually like it's the whole start of a path of healing, of starting to understand that, of taking care of maybe the needs that the little you needed, right? That weren't taken care of when you were little. Yeah, there's a lot in that. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why it can be a path of healing for, just parenthood in general. It can be a path of healing for both you and your kid. Okay, but regardless of whether we're triggered or not, whether our kid is tantruming or not, like we want to stay patient too. Like this is like the goal, right? These are the North Stars, that we want to stay patient in these really messy moments. Your book talks about this. What are some tips for helping parents stay regulated throughout their own big feelings, their kids' big feelings? What can we do?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I like to say is, we have a choice in these moments where we could stay and woulda, coulda, shoulda land, looking through the rear view mirror, really beating ourselves up, saying, oh, we're doing such a bad job, I'm failing, all the things. Or you can choose from these moments to look out the windshield, look at the horizon and say, what did I learn from this situation? What needs to happen to have it go differently next time? And like to really adopt that growth mindset and to really give yourself permission to learn alongside your toddler. And when you create that mindset shift, then it's possible to start really separating your emotions from your actions. And this is what I call, I always say, reactions are emotions in action. And what we want to do is we want to create safety. If we want to have that pause, if we want to respond to our children in from a more grounded place, then we really need to focus on creating that safety so we can disrupt the stress response and, create space between our emotions and our actions. And so the first step I always say there is to really look at physical safety. Is your child safe? Are you safe? And what I mean by that, like, is your child hitting you? Then put them down. Maybe put like a pillow in between the two of you. Say, I won't let you hit me. Is your child having a tantrum? Are they like in a place where they can like roll around on the ground and scream and cry and they're going to be okay? They're not going to hurt themselves. They're not going to fall off the bed. So really looking at, okay, is everyone physically safe? And once that physical safety has been established, we can tell ourselves, this is not an emergency. I am safe and my child is safe. That's like really how we can start disrupting that stress response. And from there, it doesn't matter if you respond to your child 5 seconds from then, 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes later, an hour later. There's space, because as long as everyone is physically safe, you have time to get grounded. And during this time, you can start looking at, okay, what are some simple ways that I can ground myself? Is it smelling some essential oils? Is it taking some deep breaths? Is it opening the window and getting a breath of fresh air? Is it counting? What might be the thing for you that helps you get grounded? And another thing that I find really helpful in these moments is really validating ourselves, because gosh, no one's going to come and validate us in the thick of things. It's really up to us to say, gosh, I'm feeling frustrated. I'm having a hard time, or I really feel unheard right now. I'm really exhausted and this is hard. Just really validating yourself and how you feel in that moment can make such a huge difference in just softening, accepting, and calming down. Because when we try to shove all our emotions into like a suitcase, it gets bigger and bigger and you're trying to zip it, you're sitting on it. We've all been there, right? And then all of a sudden the zipper bursts and everything explodes. And so that's why it's so important, this idea of creating physical safety to create the emotional safety before we respond to our kids.
I like that. It's physical safety first and then that emotional safety. And yeah, I think that's such a great call to just remind parents that, you taking care of yourself is super beneficial for your kid, right? Because that it leads you to being able to stay patient, to being able to, your well-being leads to their well-being. It all cascades down from you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's so powerful. And there's, what I was talking about was really like mostly like in the moment, right? And then we have to also kind of take a look at, okay, how many in the moment moments are we having right now? Do I need to take some time outside of the heat of the moment to do something for myself? Is there something that I can do just in 5 minutes that's going to nourish some aspect of myself and my life to take care of myself, right? Because self-care I find doesn't happen unless we're kind of fitting it into the in-between moments, right? And that 3 minutes here, that 5 minutes there, sometimes that's the best we can do, but not skipping those 5 minutes, because those 5 minutes can really mean a lot.
Yeah. Don't fritter them away on TikTok or Instagram.
Exactly.
You're more important. Okay. Your book also includes some red flags for parents to watch out for. Without alarming parents, can you share a couple of signs that it's time for them to seek extra support as far as their kids' behavior?
Yes, I was really passionate about including like these red flags so parents know when it might be time to, get a referral or to look for extra support. So, for example, in general with behavior, if your child's behavior is to the point where it's like disrupting daily life for the entire family and the entire family is not able to go on and do the things that they would normally do, or you feel like you're walking on eggshells every moment because setting off your child might lead to an hour or more of meltdowns and upset, then that might be a sign that it's time to talk to your pediatrician to, get some extra support there and to get some referrals. Or potentially even with picky eating, it's fairly common for toddlers to be selective eaters. However, if your toddler's down to like 10 foods or only eat like one food group or only one color of food, then this might be a sign that you need to get an evaluation with a feeding specialist or feeding therapist for extra support. And I just want to say that this doesn't mean that your child is broken or needs fixed. It's really about getting the support to help you and your child thrive. So it's not necessarily something bad or something wrong. It's about saying like, gosh, we're struggling here. What support do we need to be successful in these moments?
All right, good. I'm glad we talked about that. I think it's important to figure that out, but I'd love to leave it on like maybe a little lighter note too. Like we've talked about all the challenges, the developmental, there's also so many fun developmental things happening. Do you have any tips for something that's like fun developmentally this is a great time for parents to do with their toddler?
Oh my goodness. Well, there's so many things. I mean, I think one thing is getting outside with your child. I mean, toddlers love to experiment and explore, and like getting out in nature, going on nature walks, getting out there, I think is just such an amazing time to help your child experiment and explore. And it's so good for your child's nervous system and for your nervous system as well as a parent to spend time out in nature. And so I always tell parents, like, if things are challenging or you just want to go on a fun adventure, get outside. Like that is one of the best things that you can do at this age. And there's always an adventure waiting.
I think that's true. Like that was always kind of like, okay, when in doubt, just to get them outside, like
Yes.
Get outside and something will be figured out or created, or we'll all just feel we can breathe a little bit more easily.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Devon, thank you so much. This is so helpful. Devon's book that is out today is called Transforming Toddlerhood: How to Handle Tantrums and Power Struggles and Raise Resilient Kids Without Losing Your Mind. And you've gotten a taste of it today, but it is out today. Go grab it anywhere books are sold. Thank you so much, Devon. You have worked with these crazy, psychotic little, I mean that in the most loving way, beings for so long, and it really is so helpful to talk to you and get the grounding and the acceptance and the just like loving words of wisdom that you have about toddlers. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having me here today.